The trouble with learned men, as Lord Peter Wimsey was in the habit of observing, is that they will insist on dying at the most inconvenient moment of the discourse. A bishop may be permitted to expire at inconclusion, and a politician at if I may say so, but a don who collapses precisely between ladies and gentlemen and his first intelligible verb shows a culpable disregard for academic tradition. It was therefore singularly tactless of Dr. Edwin Farnham, Senior Fellow of St. Severin's College, Oxford, to contrive his own dramatic exit on an October evening when the hall was full. The warden was present in state, and the electric lights, being modern, had every appearance of behaving themselves. "Dead, ain't he?" murmured Wimsey, craning his long neck from the back row of the old library, where he had taken refuge from the more earnest of the undergraduates. "Hush!" said the warden, though in a tone which suggested that the remark, while deplorable, was not inaccurate. Doctor. Farnham lay forward across the green baize-covered lectern, his gown hanging like a pair of melancholy wings. A glass of water, untouched, stood at his elbow. His manuscript, tied with black tape, remained bound and mysteriously unread, like a Victorian novel of improving tendency. "Most inconsiderate," went on Wimsey, sotto voce. "All Oxford has come to hear whether Judas Iscariot was a misunderstood economic determinist, and the fellow bolts without so much as a footnote. The college doctor, a brisk person in tweeds, made such examinations as could be decently performed in front of 100 craning necks, then straightened with the resigned air of a man defeated by a heart which had not troubled to provide dramatic stigmata. Sudden failure, he announced. We must clear the room. Very distressing. A pity, remarked Wimsey to his companion, the dean, as the audience began to shuffle and whisper their way towards the doors. I was looking forward to discovering whether eternal damnation could be squared with the latest excavations at Jericho. Young men nowadays, puffed the dean, who had not been young since the South African War, don't come for the theology, my dear Wimsey. They come to see whether Farnham would really dare say what he was reported to have said in private. And now he has achieved the unique distinction of making his most controversial utterance by not uttering it at all. Outside in the quadrangle the air was misty and a little too cold, as though the stone walls retained a memory of older, less hygienic epochs. A bell somewhere struck 8 with that peculiarly sepulchral tone which Oxford bells reserve for moments of academic disaster. A young man in a scholar's gown, pale and prominent of Adam's apple, hurried up to them. "Dean, sir, Dr. Paget says, would you come to the senior common room at once? The warden wishes to speak with you, and Lord Peter Wimsey, isn't it? Dr. Paget begged that you would come too, my lord, if you would be so good." "When a college physician sends for one in those terms," mused Wimsey, "it is never to discuss golf. Lead on, my Cassius." In the senior common room, the fire burned low, as though in deference to the occasion. The heavy portraits of departed worthies regarded the living with their habitual blank malice. Dr. Paget, the bursar, the warden, and Inspector Granger of the Oxford City Police formed a little island of disturbed humanity in the middle of the shabby armchairs. "Lord Peter," began the warden, "I am very sorry to drag you into this, but Inspector Granger feels that, in view of certain circumstances, your presence may be useful." "Bodies at Oxford," said Wimsey, helping himself to a cigarette, "are never purely corporeal, warden. They are metaphysical statements. What particular proposition has Farnham been advancing by dying?" Inspector Granger, a square man who disliked metaphysics on principle, cleared his throat. "Dr. B. Farnham didn't die of heart failure, my lord. We've every reason to think he was poisoned, and it looks on the face of it as though somebody in St. Severin's didn't want that lecture delivered." The Dean of St. O. Severin's arrived with the air of a man summoned to an inconvenient committee meeting, and only gradually permitted his expression to accommodate the reality of the situation. He was short, precise, and exuded an aroma of well-bred disapproval. "Dead?" he repeated, as though Wimsey had suggested that Dr. Farnham had taken to Morris dancing in the quad. "Indisputably," said Wimsey.
Unless this is an unusually realistic demonstration for your undergraduates.
I should not recommend it as a regular feature. It might lower the applications from the public schools. The dean shot him a quick, narrow glance, as if uncertain whether this visitor was to be classed as an ally or a visitation of divine judgment. And you are Whimsy, Peter. I have occasionally been known to take an interest in untimely deaths, particularly when they occur in surroundings so picturesque. Your porter will bear me out. The porter, Jenkins, thus appealed to, shuffled and nodded. Begging your pardon, sir, but it's his lordship what found the doctor, just as he is now, like, hasn't been touched. Quite right, said Whimsy. If there is one thing the dead consistently resent, it is being tidied away prematurely. Have you sent for the police? Yes, my lord. Inspector Brathwaite from the city force. He's on his way. Brathwaite, murmured Whimsy. I recall him in connection with a regrettable misunderstanding about a tobacconist and a missing curate. Honest fellow, not imaginative, a useful combination to work with. The dean stiffened perceptibly. I must say, Lord Peter, I had not contemplated, well, an extended investigation. Dr. Farnham has always been delicate. The strain of his researches has apparently extended to his tea, said Whimsy gently. The aroma is not entirely that recommended by the late Earl Grey. Of course, I may be mistaken, and Dr. Farnham may merely have been experimenting with extremely unorthodox flavourings. The dean's gaze followed his to the cup and lingered there uneasily. You suspect foul play? I should not dare to impugn the doctor's digestion in any other sense, replied Whimsy. Tell me, Dean, was he a popular man? In the academic sense, said the dean cautiously. That is to say, he was greatly respected. Ah, said Whimsy. Then we must carefully distinguish between respect and affection. They so seldom coincide, particularly in a senior common room. There was a discreet tap of heels in the corridor, and Inspector Brathwaite appeared, a tall, spare man in a serviceable raincoat, whose eyes took in the situation with business-like efficiency. He accepted the dean's explanations with a minimum of deference and permitted Whimsy's presence with a resigned recognition.
I've heard of you, my lord, he said. You were in on that business at Duke's Denver, weren't you? Among other regrettable episodes in my career, said Whimsy.
You'll be wanting to see the scene untouched, I imagine. Jenkins has been admirably inhibitory. Brathwaite examined the body, the cup, and the room in a methodical silence, pausing only to have the lamp adjusted and the curtains drawn back to admit the dim, fog-throttled
light from the quad. No signs of a struggle, he observed. Nothing disturbed. Door was locked? On the inside, said Jenkins. As usual, sir. Dr.
Farnham always turned the key when he was working. Windows, bolted. They always stick, this damp weather, volunteered the dean. Brathwaite grunted. We'll have the police surgeon round, of course. Until then, nothing touched. I'll need to speak to those who saw him last alive. The domestic circle of Senat.
Severins, murmured Whimsy. I collect, Dean, that includes the servants, the fellows, and possibly Providence? The servants first, said Brathwaite, ignoring him.
They notice more than most people think. Porter, who brought in the tea. Jenkins looked uncomfortable. That'd be Mrs. Larkins, sir, the housekeeper. She sent it by one of the scouts. Young fellow's servant. Trotter, his name is. I'll fetch him. Do, said Whimsy pleasantly. I have an incurable curiosity about tea trays. The dean winced at the levity, but the inspector's eye had already sharpened. You think there's something in the tray, my lord? There usually is, said Whimsy. Whether it is cyanide or something more subtle, we shall have the pleasure of discovering. He took another delicate breath of the air near the cup, and for the first time looked doubtful. Unless, of course, he added softly, the good doctor has contrived to die of something even less convenient than poison. Inspector Brathwaite, having finished his methodical inspection of the body, straightened with a faint creak of protest from his knees. Well, his lordship may be right about the tea. We'll have the remains analysed, of course. But if the murderer was already in the room, we must know who had access before the doctor dismissed his scout. The college, I fear, said the Dean, is full of keys. Tradition, my dear Inspector, is an untidy custodian. Quite so, murmured Whimsy. The medievals were prodigal with their portals. Still, I fancy an unofficial census of keyholders might prove instructive. Brathwaite nodded. We'll begin with the obvious. Who saw Dr. Farnham this evening? Who had reasons, academic or otherwise, to wish him silenced? Dr. Aldridge flinched visibly. Inspector, you mustn't suppose that disagreement in matters of scholarship leads us to wish each other dead. St. Severin's is not a Borgia household. Merely a place, said Whimsy pleasantly, where reputations, fellowships and future appointments depend on who footnotes whom. A milder species of poison, but occasionally just as fatal. The Dean cast him a reproachful glance, but did not contradict him. Dr.
Aldridge, Brathwaite said, adopting his most neutral tone, you were to dine with Dr. Farnham. Yes, at 7 he sent a note at 5:30, cancelling it.
Said he had discovered something in the archives and must work on. I dined in hall instead. Anybody see you there? Half the college, Aldridge answered with a shade too much eagerness. The senior common room was quite full. I sat between Miss Channing, our medievalist, and young Mr. Latham, the historian. We discussed... He hesitated. We discussed Silas, as it happens, his forthcoming lecture. Enthusiastically, inquired Whimsy. There was debate, Aldridge admitted. Some felt his treatment of certain iconographic traditions was, well, reckless, but academic quarrelling is scarcely motive for murder. That, dear doctor, said Whimsy gently, depends upon the stakes. Few men commit murder merely to manipulate a footnote, but they might do so to avert ruin, scandal, or exposure. Did Dr. Farnham's discoveries touch on anything more terrestrial than gargoyles? Aldridge hesitated. He hinted, only hinted, that some of the college's foundation narratives were, shall we say, idealized, but that has been whispered for years. Old rumors of certain benefactions, royal or otherwise, not being quite what the college histories make them. The more ancient the institution, Whimsy observed, the longer the opportunities for discreet forgery, and a forged past is often more valuable than a forged check. Bunting shifted again, clearing his throat with the quiet obstinacy of one who believes he possesses information of importance and resents not being asked for it. Whimsy noticed at once. Yes, Bunting, you have a contribution to our little symposium. Begging your pardon, my lord, it's only, well, about the keys, like the inspector said.
Dr. Farnham was touchy as anything about kept his door double locked. But he did have visitors now and then of an evening. Visitors? Brathwaite pounced.
What visitors? Mostly college folk, Bunting conceded reluctantly. Dr. Aldridge now and again, Miss Channing twice last month, and that gentleman from London, him what came about the manuscripts. All heads turned. What gentleman from London? Asked Brathwaite sharply. Bunting looked uneasy. Name of Herrick, sir, neat dresser, soft voice, said he was from some society for old books and such. Come to look at the Severin manuscripts. Spent hours shut in with Dr. Farnham, he did. Arguing sometimes, quiet-like, but sharp. Last time was, he frowned. Tuesday week, sir, in the evening. Left late. Dr. Farnham told me not to mention it to anyone. Said it would just cause unnecessary talk. How very collegiate, murmured Whimsy. One might almost suppose that secrecy grew here like ivy. The inspector scribbled. We'll have this Herrick traced. Dean, I shall require the college's permission to search Dr. Beale. Farnham's rooms and his papers. The Dean winced as though at an invasive medical procedure. The circumstances being what they are, Inspector, the college will, of course, cooperate fully, but I must insist that any delicate discoveries be handled with the utmost discretion. Discretion, said Whimsy, is the one commodity of which a university never has sufficient supply. He moved again to the half-finished manuscript, eyeing the jagged halt of the pen stroke. The ink had dried in a tiny clot, midway through the word profound. His gaze travelled from the page to the cold teacup, then to the window, where old stone grotesques peered inward with stony malice. "I wonder," he said softly, almost to himself, "whether it was the gargoyles that made you dangerous, Dr. Yeed. Farnham, or something rather less picturesque that you chanced upon while pursuing them." The library, with its shadowed alcoves and towering shelves, seemed suddenly more crowded than before, not with living men, but with unspoken motives, half-concealed antagonisms, and the faint, persistent odour of bitter almonds. Inspector Brathwaite, having noted the bursar's discomfiture with professional satisfaction, snapped his notebook shut. "For tonight, that'll do. Body to the mortuary, proper examination in the morning. Nobody is to remove so much as a pencil from this room without my say-so. Dean, I'll want a list of everyone with keys and where they were from 6 o'clock onwards." The little procession began to disperse, Aldridge making murmured apologies to the corpse, Hartwell protesting faintly about the disruption to college business, the Dean shuffling out like a displaced ecclesiastical relic. Bunting hovered in the doorway, his ferret eyes darting between Whimsy and the tea tray with peculiar intensity. Lord Peter lingered, hands deep in his pockets, studying the encircling shelves with lazy curiosity. "Tell me, Inspector, have you ever noticed that college libraries are constructed on the assumption that no one will ever wish to open a window?" Brathwaite, who knew better than to dismiss this as mere conversational flummery, glanced automatically at the mullioned casements. "They look shut." "Indeed they do," said Whimsy, "and barred for good measure, yet there is a distinct draught in this august repository of learning. Observe the flame, Inspector. Positively lyrical." The solitary lamp flame was weaving in a faint but definite current of air. "So a window's open somewhere." "Not a window, I fancy." Whimsy drifted along the wall like an absent-minded ghost until he reached a dark recess between two bookcases where the panelling bore the faint, rubbed look of long handling. He laid his hand against an innocuous carved boss. There was a barely audible click, followed by a soft exhalation of stale air, and a narrow section of panelling swung inward by an inch. Brathwaite's exclamation was almost reverent. "A secret door!" "Nothing so melodramatic," corrected Whimsy mildly, widening the crack to reveal a narrow passage, smelling of dust and stone. "Merely a priest's hole or postern from the days when a man's theology might shorten his life expectancy. Now, Inspector, if one wished to visit Dr. A. Farnham unobserved, or to leave his sanctum without troubling the porter or the college keys, would not such a contrivance prove useful?" The inspector peered into the gloom. "Where does it lead?" "That," said Whimsy, "is a fascinating question which I shall leave you the vulgar joy of answering. I never spoil a policeman's best scenes. Meanwhile, I propose to make the acquaintance of Miss Channing and Mr. Latham. Murder is all very well, but unadulterated academic spite is much more illuminating." They emerged into the cloister, where the fog pressed against the ancient stone like wet wool. Brathwaite detailed a constable to guard the library door and another to explore the hidden passage with the porter. Whimsy, humming a bar of Purcell rather tunelessly, made for the senior common room. They found Miss Channing in a deep armchair by the fire, surrounded by a defensive ring of papers and books. She was a spare, dark woman with an uncompromising jaw, the sort of person who would have corrected Thomas Aquinas on a point of doctrine and then footnoted him into submission. Young Latham lounged opposite, attempting to balance a teacup on his knee with more confidence than success. "I suppose you've come about poor Silas," Miss Channing said without preamble, pushing aside a folio. "The Dean has already told me the bare bones. I trust you've left his manuscripts where they were." "Inspector Brathwaite has them under reverent guard," said Whimsy. "One almost expects them to be carried about in procession with lighted tapers. May I ask, Miss Channing, at what hour you last saw Dr. Farnham alive?" "This afternoon, in the combination room," she replied crisply. "At 4. He was pacing up and down, muttering about inscriptions and decisive evidence. I advised him to sit down and drink his tea before toppling into the fireplace. And this evening, Whimsy's tone was airy. In hall, I noticed his absence as soon as I sat down. Silas never missed a meal if he could help it. Food was his one concession to the flesh.
A shadow, not quite grief, passed over her face. When Aldridge said he'd cancelled dinner, I assumed he'd finally found a fact that matched one of his theories.
Latham, who had been fidgeting with his teaspoon, burst out, "Everyone's going to say it was the lecture. Half the college was in a state about it. The idea that our hallowed gargoyles might be—" He flushed and glanced at Miss Channing. "Well, not quite what they've been taken for. Clay saints with feet of plaster," suggested Whimsy. "Forgive me, I'm but a layman among the theologians. Did Dr.
Farnham share any details of his shocking revelation with you, Mr. Latham?" "Only hints," the young man admitted.
He'd been down to the scaffolding with the restoration chaps, examining some newly uncovered stonework. Said there were traces of an earlier inscription beneath the weathering, that the original carvings weren't merely decorative. He was frightfully excited. Said it would embarrass certain vested interests. "How tactless of the Middle Ages," murmured Whimsy. "They never consider modern endowments when chiselling their little messages in Latin." His gaze drifted, apparently idly, to the mantelpiece clock.
"That timepiece, Miss Channing, has it been losing, by any chance?" She looked surprised. "As a matter of fact, yes, it's been 10 minutes slow all week."
"The Dean complained about it this evening." "How punctual of him," said Whimsy gently. "And your hall dinner, does it still commence at 7 precisely, with the Dean's gong prefiguring paradise by 5 minutes?" "Naturally." "Naturally," he echoed. "Then you, Miss Channing, were seated in hall before the stroke of 7, consulting your wine-glass. Mr. Latham likewise?" "I was late," Latham admitted miserably. "I ran in just as the soup was being served. The Dean gave me one of his looks." "At what time did the fellows rise from table?" "8:30, perhaps a little later," said Miss Channing. "Coffee in the common room as usual. We broke up around 10. "How regular," murmured Whimsy. "Oxford, like the Almighty, moves in mysterious yet strictly scheduled ways." He rose, dusting imaginary crumbs from his knees. "Inspector, if you will be so good as to verify those times with the buttery books and the servants, I shall go and look at some gargoyles. When theology takes to climbing the scaffolding, one ought to follow it up." The exploration of the passage was accomplished with lanterns, dust, and a quantity of language from the constables which, had the founders of Saint Severin's been present, might have provoked a visitation of disciplinary spectres. Inspector Brathwaite directed operations with the grim satisfaction of a man who has at last been given something solid, if cobwebbed, to investigate. "It runs behind the library wall," reported a constable, emerging to sneeze violently. "Then along toward the chapel, narrow as a ledger and damp as a cellar. Comes out behind the organ loft, sir. Little door masked by panelling, bolt on the inside." "So our murderer," Brathwaite summarized, "could slip from the chapel into the library and out again without touching the quad or troubling the porters. Or," added Whimsy mildly, "our innocent medieval enthusiast creeping about out of sheer antiquarian sentiment. One must be fair, Inspector. Secret passages have a deplorable tendency to incriminate anyone with a taste for romance." The body having been removed and the library sealed, the party spilled reluctantly into the quadrangle. The fog still pressed close, thickening the gaslit air into something nearly tactile. The chapel loomed ahead, its tower disappearing into the mist, grotesques peering down from the eaves with stony disapproval. Miss Channing fell into step beside Whimsy as they crossed the worn flagstones. "You believe this hinges upon the gargoyles?" she said quietly. "My dear Miss Channing," said Whimsy, "I endeavour never to believe anything until it has had a proper chance to lie to me. But I confess that when a murdered theologian writes ecstatically about stone monsters and then expires in their architectural shadow, One feels almost bound in honor to give them a hearing. You make it sound theatrical, she remarked, with a little lift of the eyebrow. It is theatrical, he returned. Murder always is. The corpse is only the final curtain. The real play is in the stage management. He paused, glancing back across the quad. Tell me, this Mr. Herrick from London, you said nothing of him when we met in the library. Because I was waiting to see whether Bunting would. Her mouth compressed slightly. One learns, Lord Peter, that in college politics, information is a form of currency best spent judiciously. Herrick claimed to be representing a private collector interested in ecclesiastical carvings. Silas thought him an ally. I did not. Why not? He asked too few questions and understood too much. He knew the exact sum of the Restoration Fund, the details of the insurance policy on the gargoyles, and the terms of Hartwell's contract with Higgins and Sons.
That is not the knowledge of a disinterested antiquarian. Very true, said Whimsy. A genuine scholar must be almost aggressively impractical about money.
Did he attend hall this evening? I didn't see him, she replied. If he was in college, he kept to the shadows, but he dined here on Tuesday after his interview with Silas. They quarrelled. About theology? About ownership, Miss Channing said crisply. Of truth, of stone, of reputations. They had reached the chapel steps. Whimsy paused, listening. Somewhere high above, the great bell shifted in its frame with a dull metallic groan, as though resenting this nocturnal disturbance. You have evening prayers? He inquired. Not on Fridays. The bell you heard earlier marks the quarter hours only. The great bell is rung at 6, 9, and midnight. Old foundations statute, she smiled faintly. We are governed as much by bells as by common sense. How restricting, murmured Whimsy. Common sense is so seldom in evidence.
He looked up into the shifting mist. If the bell rings at 9, one hears it distinctly from the library. Distinctly? She shook her head.
From the library it is muffled, like a sound behind heavy curtains. The only place where it is truly deafening is in the passage behind the organ loft. Ah, said Whimsy thoughtfully, so a man walking that passage at 9 would require very little imagination to feel himself summoned to judgment. He mounted the steps, Miss Channing following. Inside, the chapel air was chill and faintly scented with stone dust. The scaffolding rose like a monstrous cage along the south wall, reaching to the dimly seen eaves where the gargoyles crouched beyond the glass.
They are rather fine in their way, Whimsy remarked, gazing up. One almost regrets their spurious baptismal certificate. They are lies in stone, she said flatly.
Silas meant to pull the lie into the light. You think someone decided to preserve the stone at the cost of the man. I think, said Whimsy slowly, that someone calculated time, opportunity and noise with more care than is usual in crimes of mere passion. The bell at 9, the passage, the locked door, the tea at 6:30, it makes a little tune of its own. In the silence that followed, the clock in the tower began to strike the hour. The sound rolled down through stone and scaffolding, swelling, distorting, until in the echoing nave it was less like a bell than like some enormous slow heartbeat. Whimsy listened to it with his head slightly tilted, as though the sound itself were giving evidence. Yes, he murmured at last. Our murderer, I fancy, is very much concerned with what can and cannot be heard. The chapel of St. Severin's had the air of a building that considered its own survival a personal insult. The exterior stonework hunched against the October fog, its row of gargoyles jutting from the roofline like a jury of malformed judges peering down upon the quadrangle. The scaffolding erected by Higgins and Sons clung to the ancient walls in apologetic metal angles, its planks slick with mist. Whimsy paused beneath the eaves, tilting his head back to inspect the nearest grotesque. A squatting creature with disproportionately long arms and a face caught midway between laughter and agony. Observe, Inspector, he murmured. Our friend here has been decently Victorian enough to age prematurely. Note the pattern of erosion. less pronounced than those window tracery mouldings purportedly of the same date, rather like a man whose wrinkles betray only half his claimed years. Miss Channing, clutching her coat against the damp, followed his gaze. "The stone is wrong," she said quietly. "Too fine-grained. And the weathering patterns? Silas was right. They're only pretending to be medieval." "Many things in this college appear to be so engaged," Whimsy replied, his tone light but his eyes thoughtful, including, I suspect, some of its inhabitants. Inspector Brathwaite spoke to a figure emerging from the scaffolding with the resigned gait of a man reconciled to mud and bureaucracy. "You'd be Mr. Higgins." "Aye, sir," said the restorer, wiping his hands on a rag. He was a thick-shouldered fellow with careful eyes. "George Higgins. My lads have knocked off for the night." "You were working here this evening?" Brathwaite asked. "Till 6 sharp. University rules. No hammering after evensong." Higgins cast a professionally resentful glance at the stonework. "We were testing some of the joints. Rotten, some of them. Never seen such modern rubbish passed off as medieval in all my days." "How very gratifying to have independent confirmation," drawled Whimsy. "Tell me, Mr. Higgins, has anyone shown an unusual interest in your work here of late, besides the college authorities, of course?" "That gentleman from London," Higgins replied without hesitation, "soft-spoken chap in city clothes, said he represented a foundation, asked any number of questions about the stone composition, tooling marks, restoration methods. Knew his way about a chisel, if you take my meaning."
"Herrick," Brathwaite supplied. "If that's his name," Higgins said cautiously, "looked more like a dealer to me."
"The type that sniffs about cathedrals and colleges, hoping to pick up fragments no longer required for private collections." Whimsy's eyes sharpened. "And did he succeed in acquiring any such ecclesiastical souvenirs from you, Mr. Higgins?" "Not from me, my lord," Higgins answered, the my lord emerging with reluctant respect. "I run a clean shop, but he had some bit of stone with him last time I saw him. Showed it me in the cloister. Small chip, about so big," he indicated with work-roughened fingers. "Said it came from your gargoyles. The dressing on it was wrong for 14th century work. I told him so." "When was this conversation?" Brathwaite asked. "Tuesday evening, about 7:30. Choir was practicing. Sound shakes the glass in the clear estuary." Miss Channing looked towards the darkened windows. "Silas took that fragment from the north transept gargoyle. He showed it to me in the library on Wednesday. Said it was the physical key to everything." "And now, both stone and scholar have vanished," Whimsy murmured. "One into dust, the other into, what shall we say, private archives." They entered the chapel through a side door, the air inside heavy with old incense and older secrets. Whimsy's steps echoed lightly on the stone. High above, the gargoyles projected as sinister silhouettes against the dim, clerestory light. "The vestry door?" Brathwaite prompted. Miss Channing led them to a carved oak door, partially obscured by a dark wooden press. Behind it, just as Higgins had described, another panel bore the faint outline of a latch. Brathwaite examined it closely. No lock. Anyone in the vestry could slip through to the library passage. And anyone in the library, Whimsy added, could arrive here quite unnoticed during choir practice, when all honest ecclesiastical attention was directed towards the Almighty. He stepped into the vestry, eyes travelling over cassocks, surplices, and a small writing table on which lay a bottle of ink and a sheaf of parish notices. Something glittered faintly on the stone floor beneath the clothes press. Whimsy stooped and retrieved a minute object between gloved fingers. "Ah, our versatile Mr.
Herrick again." It was a cufflink, plain gold, but engraved on the back with an elegant monogram. H.R. "Gate book says he never left," Brathwaite muttered.
If he used the passage, he might have come straight here after visiting Dr. Farnham," Whimsy finished, "or before, or done something infinitely more interesting than either of those obvious alternatives." He slipped the cufflink into an envelope. "In any case, Inspector, we must find Mr. Herrick." Men who lose their jewellery in vestries seldom do so without entangling themselves morally as well as sartorially. Miss Channing's gaze had wandered to the altar. Her face, usually composed, showed a flicker of unease. "Silas said the worst part wasn't the forgery," she murmured. "It was what the Victorians had hidden inside the new gargoyles." "Hidden?" Brathwaite repeated sharply. "What, for heaven's sake?" She hesitated. "He never told me. Only that once I knew, I would understand why certain people would rather kill than see the lecture delivered." Whimsy's glance went up once more to the leering stone figures in the shadows, their mouths frozen in silent mockery. Then he said softly, "I think it is time we ask the gargoyles themselves what they have been keeping in their bellies for the last 60 years. They returned to the old library by the same route, torch beams glancing along damp stone and the skeletal timbers of the passage. The air within had cooled perceptibly, as though the books themselves disapproved of such nocturnal activity. Dr. Farnham's body had been removed, but the chair, the desk, and the little island of lamplight remained exactly as they had been, like the outline of a vanished figure on a crime scene diagram. Bunting stood by the door, hat twisted between his hands, an image of injured loyalty waiting to be vindicated. He brightened visibly when he saw Whimsy and the inspector, like a dog expecting praise for having dug up something particularly noisome. "I've not left the corridor, sir," he began. "Stayed just as you said, in case the corpse decided to take a little stroll," murmured Whimsy. "Quite commendable. Constancy is a virtue too little appreciated in modern criminal cases. Now then, Bunting, let us review your evening with the care we customarily reserve for liturgical calendars."
The scout swallowed. "I took up the tray at 6:30, my lord, same as every night when Dr. Farnham was working late. Knocked, he called out, 'Come in, Bunting.' I went in, set the tray over there," he gestured, "and left." "Without seeing his face?" Whimsy prompted, his tone amiable. "Well, he was writing, my lord, head down, but it were his voice right enough." "Did he say anything else? Complain about the tea, perhaps? He appears to have had good reason."
"No, my lord, just, 'That will be all, Bunting,' same as always." Inspector Brathwaite produced the gate book with a certain solemnity. "Bunting, what time did you notice the gentleman from London leaving this evening?" The scout licked his lips. "I didn't see him go, sir. Last I saw of him was just after 6. He came in from the quad and went straight up here. He told me Dr. Farnham was expecting him." "Herrick says he found the doctor already dead at 6:30, Brathwaite observed. "You say you heard the doctor's voice at the same time. One of you is lying, or both of you are mistaken." Whimsy, who had been examining the chair with feline absorption, now spoke without looking up. "Bunting, be so kind as to sit down at the desk, just as you last saw Dr. Farnham." The man hesitated, crossed himself surreptitiously, and obeyed. Whimsy moved behind him, adjusting the chair with a fastidious touch. "Pen in your left hand, Bunting." "I'm right-handed, my lord." "Humour me." The scout complied, looking as though he expected Latin incantations to follow. Whimsy stepped back. "Now, say 'Come in, Bunting,' just as you heard it." Bunting obeyed. The voice, issuing from a bowed head and turned shoulders, was curiously muffled and quite indistinguishable except in its general masculinity. "You see, Inspector," said Whimsy mildly, "one need not be a professional mimic to produce that effect. One merely needs to know the formula and the appropriate degree of academic impatience." He shifted Bunting back out of the chair, then seated himself in the same position, his head bent over the manuscript. When he spoke, his tone was a precise echo of the one they had just heard. "Come in, Bunting." The sound was identical, flat, blurred, stripped of personality by the desk, the books, and the echoing chamber. Brathwaite exhaled. "So anybody of roughly the same build could have managed it." "Precisely, which returns us to the tea." Whimsy regarded the tray with the affection of a man considering a stubborn chess problem. "Our murderer required 3 things: time alone with the body, access to cyanide, and an excuse for coming and going without remark. Miss Channing, who had followed them back, spoke with dry decisiveness. Cyanide is kept in the chemistry laboratories under lock and key, but agricultural supply shops sell it freely enough in convenient quantities. Rat poison, fumigants, orchard treatment, any fellow with a cottage and a garden could obtain it without attracting notice. True, said Whimsy, but here is the more delicate point. The killer needed to be good enough with a pen to imitate Farnham's last line, yet careless or hurried enough to trail off mid-word. Our late doctor, according to his notes, never left a sentence unfinished. It offended his sense of order. Aldridge, who had reappeared like a nervous shade in academic tweed, flushed faintly. He did have that peculiarity, he admitted. Silas would revise a paragraph 12 times rather than let it stand incomplete. So, Whimsy continued, the last sentence is not his, it is theatre. A neat academic curtain fall constructed by someone who knew his habits and wished to advertise them. Someone with access to his papers, to this room, to his schedule. Bunting, who knew that Dr. Farnham was expected to dine with Aldridge tonight. Well, everyone in hall, my lord. Dr. Aldridge told Miss Channing and Mr. Latham at luncheon that he and the doctor were dining in town instead. And when the cancellation came at 5:30, Aldridge coloured. He sent a note, said his discovery couldn't wait. I showed it round the SCR. Half the senior common room knew of his change of plans within the hour. It was excellent gossip. Just so, murmured Whimsy. Our murderer did not lack information. The more interesting question is, who required an empty library between 6 and 7, and who profited by Dr. Farnham's silence? The library seemed suddenly to tighten around them, the towering shelves leaning inward like eavesdropping monks. Outside, the college clock began to strike 9, each resonant boom settling itself into the reconstructed timeline like a judgment pronounced. The night advanced with the obstinate determination peculiar to damp English evenings, the fog outside thickening into an almost tangible substance, while within the library the circle of lamplight contracted around Whimsy and Inspector Brathwaite like a conspiratorially whispered secret. The corpse had been removed, the medical men dispatched, yet the presence of Dr. Silas Farnham lingered obstinately in ink, stone dust, and the faint scent of bitter almonds clinging to the air. Brathwaite, who had been consulting his notes with furrowed brow, looked up with the expression of a man reluctantly arriving at an unwelcome but necessary conclusion. We must sort the time question properly, Lord Peter. If Herrick found the body cold at 6:30 and Bunting delivered tea at 6:30, then either Herrick lies or Bunting served his tray to an empty chair. Or, Whimsy suggested mildly, to a corpse already efficiently posed by an industrious murderer. He moved to the window, gazing out into the opaque whiteness pressing against the glass. Consider, Inspector. Rigor mortis, cooling rates. Our medical chap estimates Farnham died at least an hour before we found him, possibly longer. Allow generous margins, and we have a window between, say, 5 and 6:30 for the actual administration of poison, after which our killer arranges the body, tidies the desk, and rehearses their impersonation for Bunting's benefit. But the cyanide was in the tea, Brathwaite objected.
We have the smell. The analysis underway, there's no doubt. In the tea, yes, Whimsy agreed, but not necessarily in the last cup poured. Remember, Dr.
Farnham was working all afternoon. Our murderer might easily have introduced poison into the teapot at an earlier stage, then simply ensured a final, convincing tableau with the evening service. Bunting's tray becomes a theatrical prop rather than the fatal instrument itself. Miss Channing, who had refused to be sent to bed on the reasonable grounds that genuine medievalists are seldom afforded front-row seats at practical demonstrations of scholastic homicide, spoke with her usual precise calm. Silas frequently drank tea while working. The pot in his rooms would still be warm at 5 o'clock. If someone visited him then, they could have tampered with it under the guise of refreshing the brew. Quite, said Whimsy. Now, who visited him between 4 and 6 this afternoon? The Dean, summoned again with resigned martyrdom, produced a small notebook from his clerical coat. Dr. Farnham signed out of hall luncheon at 1, went directly to the archives, and remained there until 4 o'clock. The archivist confirms this. At 4, he returned to his rooms. At 4:30, Mr. Hartwell called upon him. They spoke for approximately 20 minutes. At 5, Miss Channing brought him additional reference material from the Bodleian. At 5:30, he sent the note, cancelling dinner with Dr. Aldridge. At 6, choir practice began. At 6:30, Bunting delivered tea. "How very tidy," murmured Whimsy. "One almost suspects the hand of Providence in constructing such a convenient symmetry of opportunity." Hartwell, who had reappeared with the air of a man keen to monitor proceedings that might affect his professional survival, bristled. "My visit was entirely innocuous. We discussed the Restoration Fund accounts. Dr. Farnham wished to verify certain expenditure figures before his lecture." "Indeed," Whimsy's voice carried that silky note that suggested impending discomfort for someone. "Expenditure such as preliminary stone procurement, perhaps, replacement gargoyles acquired in advance of full restoration approval. It must be most vexing to discover that your carefully managed Victorian fraud is not only historically dubious, but financially precarious." Hartwell's flush deepened alarmingly. "The fund is entirely above board. Every penny accounted for. I have the ledgers in my rooms if you wish to examine them." "Oh, I do wish it," said Whimsy pleasantly, with a fervour bordering on the theological.
"But not just yet." He turned to Miss Channing. "When you visited at 5, did Dr. Farnham seem disturbed?" She hesitated, agitated certainly.
He had just finished reading the Victorian correspondence. He said, "They lied to us, Eleanor. They lied to everyone, and now they are doing it again with better stationery." I assumed he meant the Restoration Prospectus. "How modern of him," Whimsy murmured. "Forgery moved from stone to paper, a natural historical progression." Brathwaite snapped his notebook shut. "So 3 probable visitors in our critical period. Hartwell at 4:30, Miss Channing at 5. The messenger with the telegram from Herrick shortly after. And meanwhile Herrick himself arrives at 5:45, finds the body at 6:30, or so he claims. Quite a crowded hour for an introverted medievalist, observed Whimsy. One almost wonders how he found time to be murdered. The library seemed to contract around them, the shadows between the shelves deepening as the lamps burned lower. Somewhere above, the ancient timbers creaked with the small, disquieting noises of settling age, while outside the bells of St. Severin's marked another inexorable quarter hour in the chronology of a death that refused to arrange itself into convenient narrative order. "It will not do, you know," Whimsy said softly, almost to himself. "The times, the tea, the tray, the passage, the stone dust on the left hand, they will not reconcile." Which suggests that at least one of our witnesses has lied, and lied with remarkable precision, not merely to mislead the police, but to construct an alternative timetable so plausible that only a pedant and a poet combined would notice the discrepancies. He turned from the window, his expression suddenly very bright and very dangerous. "Inspector, I think it is time we paid a social call on Mr. Hartwell's ledgers. I have always found accounts remarkably loquacious when addressed in the proper spirit." Hartwell's attempt at dignity collapsed almost immediately upon contact with Inspector Braithwaite's professional politeness. "I often take evening walks," he protested, the suitcase handle creaking under his grip. "The gardens are quite restorative after a trying day." "In October fog with a suitcase full of fresh air?" Braithwaite inquired mildly. "If you'll just set that down, sir." Higgins obliged by relieving Hartwell of the case with disobliging efficiency. At Braithwaite's nod, he snapped open the catches. The lid rose to reveal a layered composition of documents, bank books, and a chamois-wrapped bundle whose significance announced itself even before it was fully unwrapped. "Portland stone," Whimsy observed gently, taking the fragment between thumb and forefinger, complete with modern tool marks and a charming absence of medieval weathering. Our missing geological proof, I think, the very piece Dr. Farnham was clutching on Thursday. Hartwell's face blanched to the unhealthy hue of library paste. That was given to me by Mr. Higgins as part of the restoration discussions. I was simply returning it to his firm. On the 11:40 p.m. Train to London, no doubt, Whimsy murmured. How thoughtful, and the rest? Higgins, the constable, lifted out a thick packet of correspondence bound with thin green tape. Miss Channing drew a sharp breath. Those are from the sealed Victorian archive, she said quietly. Silas showed me one letter, just one. This entire bundle was kept in the strong room. Brathwaite glanced at the bursar. You have a key to the strong room, Mr. Hartwell. Of course, Hartwell snapped. It is part of my office. Then you won't mind our examining how these sealed papers came to be sharing luggage space with your pajamas, Whimsy put in amiably. Note, Inspector, the dates, 1867, 1868, are gargoyle vintage and, this one marked private, to be opened only in case of dispute. How very promising. He unfolded the brittle sheet carefully. The fading copperplate hand belonged unmistakably to a Victorian tradesman whose conscience had belatedly discovered the delights of confession. I cannot reconcile myself to the deception required, Whimsy read aloud, in passing off my new carvings as authentic 14th century work. I therefore lodge copies of the invoices and my account of the matter with the college, in case future generations should question the integrity of this undertaking. He lowered the paper, his gaze resting thoughtfully on Hartwell. Your great-grandfather's name appears in the margin, sir, in a most compromising annotation, to be discreetly withheld. The family tradition of careful custodianship seems well established. Hartwell's hands gripped the back of a chair until the knuckles showed white. If this correspondence were misinterpreted, he said hoarsely, the college's reputation would be ruined, donations withdrawn, the restoration fund questioned. Generations of benefaction would be revealed as having purchased a highly decorative falsehood, Whimsy finished smoothly. A scandal, certainly, but hardly sufficient, one would hope, to justify murder. His gaze moved from Hartwell to Miss Channing, then to Dr. Montick. Aldridge, who stood motionless, his scholarly face twisted with something uncomfortably like guilt. You see the pattern, Inspector. The murderer had to prevent tomorrow's lecture at all costs. They knew of the hidden locker key. He weighed the brass tag on his palm, and therefore needed to recover or destroy those off-site documents before Dr. or Farnham could make them public. They also knew his secret reliance on this drawer of private sugar, his tea hour, his stubborn refusal to abandon the library. Brathwaite's pencil hovered. Knowledge available to, not to Mr. Herrick, who only visited by appointment and could not roam freely through the college, Whimsy answered calmly. Nor, I think, to Miss Channing, whose relationship with Dr. Farnham, though intellectually intimate, was conducted largely in this public library. No, our killer belongs to that privileged inner circle who live and breathe the college's domestic rhythms, senior officers, long-standing fellows, and the indispensable, underpaid, omniscient servants. Bunting flinched visibly. Whimsy's tone remained almost conversational. Consider it, Inspector. Who places the sugar tin back in precisely the same position every afternoon? Who knows that the doctor takes his tea at exactly 6, works until 7, despises interruptions, and locks his door, except when he forgets? Who hears the faintest change in routine, and who is dismissed with a perfunctory, "That will be all, Bunting," whether spoken by scholar or impostor? The scout's hands twisted his cap into a strangled shape. Hartwell stared at him with dawning horror. Dr. Aldridge closed his eyes. Brathwaite looked from one to another. "You mean," he said slowly, "that there were 2 people in on this, one who planned and one who executed?" Whimsy's smile was thin and chill. "Oh, more than 2, I fancy. Murder, like medieval architecture, is rarely the work of a solitary hand. Tomorrow, Inspector, we shall require everyone concerned to assemble in the chapel, beneath those fraudulent gargoyles. I believe the stones themselves will assist with the final demonstration. The college bells began to toll the hour, each resonant stroke reverberating through the medieval timbers like a judge's gavel. Outside, the fog wrapped Severins in a suffocating shroud. Inside, knowledge and fear thickened the air as surely as incense. The stage was set, the players unwillingly gathered. Only the final arrangement of guilt and motive remained to be formally, ruthlessly displayed. They placed Hartwell's suitcase on the table where Dr. Farnham's unwritten lecture still sprawled in mute accusation. The bursar stood very straight, his hands clenched upon the back of a chair, the knuckles showing white through carefully manicured skin. The dean hovered in the background with the air of a man attending his own funeral, while Aldridge, Miss Channing, Bunting, Herrick and Higgins formed a ragged semicircle of unease about the fire. Inspector Brathwaite snapped the locks with official economy. Inside lay a neat arrangement that would have gratified any customs officer. Shirts, underclothes, a shaving kit, and, wrapped in brown paper, a thick bundle of documents, bound with red tape. Whimsy lifted the packet with delicate fingers. Ah, the theological equivalent of family skeletons, Victorian correspondence, I fancy. Hartwell made a convulsive movement. Those are college property. You have no right. My dear sir, said Whimsy, untying the tape with exasperating care, when property becomes an accessory to murder, its moral status undergoes a certain transubstantiation. He spread the papers, faded ink, ornate hands, letterheads of Higgins and Sons, stonemasons and restorers, and the Rev. D.C. Hartwell, Fellow of St. Severins. One letter, more recent, bore the modern Hartwell crest. Here we have, Whimsy continued pleasantly, the full history of the gargoyle fraud. Commissioning of Victorian grotesques under the pious label of restoration, misrepresentation to donors, insurance valuations based on fictitious antiquity, and finally, he tapped the modern letter, your own ingenious proposal to realign the present restoration fund by diverting certain sums into other, less visible deficits. Very sound finance, no doubt, but painfully vulnerable to a medieval scholar with a magnifying glass and a conscience. Hartwell's lips moved, but no sound emerged. You see, said Whimsy, turning to the others with the air of a don addressing a particularly obtuse tutorial, Dr. Farnham's discovery menaced not merely the romantic prestige of St. Severins, but the Hartwell dynasty's carefully arranged myth of benefaction. Exposure of the Victorian deception would have invited inquiries into funds then and funds now. Our bursar found himself in the uncomfortable position of standing between historical truth and financial ruin. Brathwaite interposed briskly. Motive? Yes, but we require means, Lord Peter, and opportunity. Oh, we have those in gratifying excess. Whimsy paced lightly. At 4:30 this afternoon, Mr. Hartwell visited Dr. Farnham, ostensibly about the restoration accounts. In reality, he had been warned, by whom we may speculate, that Silas had located the sealed correspondence. A most unpleasant interview ensued. Our scholar, no longer merely academic, threatened public exposure. Miss Channing gave a sharp intake of breath. He said he would announce everything tomorrow, in the lecture. Just so, said Whimsy. Our bursar departed in some agitation, taking with him a sufficiently clear notion of the evidence Farnham possessed. He had already, over years of financial discussions, acquired intimate knowledge of the doctor's habits, the private sugar tin in the desk drawer, the solitary evening tea. Poison in the college supply would be criminally reckless, but a few carefully prepared cyanide cubes slipped into that private hoard during some earlier visit. Ah, that was neat. One need only wait until Farnham, working late, desired his customary sweetening. Brathwaite nodded slowly. The sugar tin smelled strongly of almonds. The inside of the drawer, too. Precisely. Somewhere between 4:30 and 5, Whimsy went on, Mr. Hartwell contrived a brief return, by the passage most likely, to complete that delicate substitution. Then came Miss Channing at 5, the messenger at 5:30, and at some point between then and 6, Silas took his tea and his last theological stand. Dead or dying, he still clutched his bit of evidence, the stone chip, and doubtless the key to his off-site papers. Albersa could not risk a public scene while the college bustled, so he waited until the fog deepened and the quadrangles emptied, then emerged again by the old priest's way, removed the stone fragment, rearranged the body, and prepared that touching tableau of scholarly suicide. One problem remained, the time of death. Enter poor Bunting with his tray. A voice from the desk, any voice will do, if it mutters the expected formula. The scout departs, convinced he has served a living man, and obligingly supplies an alibi hour for the formal record. Whimsy turned to the scout. You never saw Silas's face, Bunting. He did not look up. Bunting swallowed. No, my lord, just the back of his head like. The impersonator, Whimsy concluded, was already in the room. A right-handed man who poured tea with milk and sugar for himself, careless of the incongruity, and later, finding Herrick's unrecorded arrival inconvenient, Mr. Hartwell attempted to extract the most damning correspondence from its station locker and depart quietly, suitcase in hand, before police methods and medieval masonry joined forces. Against him, Whimsy lifted one of the letters and pointed to a brownish smudge along the margin. Stone dust, Inspector, the same composition as the gargoyles. Albersa has been handling more than papers this week. Hartwell's resistance broke with an audible crack. He sagged into the chair, his voice emerging thin and bitter. You talk about truth, he said. Do you know what truth does to an institution? My great-grandfather saved this college from bankruptcy with those very forgeries. I did no more than continue his work. Farnham would have destroyed us. For a footnote. Not for a footnote, said Whimsy quietly. For the distinction between a college and a confidence trick. Hartwell gave a short, hopeless laugh and covered his face with his hands. Inspector Brathwaite laid a firm hand on his shoulder. Cedric Hartwell, I must ask you to accompany me to the station. Anything you say? Oh, spare me the formula, Hartwell muttered, rising with the weary dignity of a ruined statue. I have been living by formulae all my life. The bells of St. Severine's began to strike the hour, their ancient notes reverberating through stone and fog alike, as the bursar of the college walked out between two constables, his footsteps echoing like the collapse of some carefully contrived facade. Whimsy remained by the fire, gazing up at the leering gargoyles carved upon the corbels.
How these old stones do love irony, he remarked to no one in particular.
They were false from the beginning, and yet it was the attempt to preserve their imaginary virtue that finally turned them into witnesses for the prosecution. The fog had thinned by morning, as though the college, having yielded one corpse and several scandals, felt it had discharged its nightly obligations to the picturesque. Pale light filtered through the chapel windows, turning the dust in the air to drifting motes of reluctant illumination. Severine's emerged from darkness with the faintly injured dignity of an institution that has been forced to notice its own foundations. Whimsy, who had appropriated a pot of frightful college coffee from the senior common room, with the ruthless efficiency of a man beyond hope of sleep, sat in the dean's study, reviewing the previous night's events with Inspector Brathwaite. She has signed a statement, Brathwaite said, closing his notebook with the air of one who has coaxed an uncomfortable truth into formal attire. Admits preparing the poisoned sugar several days ago. Claims she meant only to frighten him, that she substituted the cubes during an earlier visit and intended to remove them before he used them. Believes herself guilty of manslaughter at worst, Whimsy observed, draping himself more comfortably in the armchair. An unfortunate reliance on the benevolence of Providence in matters of cyanide and human habit. Did she also claim she had no idea he would drink tea that particular afternoon? She says she'd planned to confront him yesterday evening, Brathwaite replied, to demand he restore her full credit in the lecture. insists she never expected him to die without that final conversation. "And yet," murmured Whimsy, "she prepared the sugar knowing perfectly well that if circumstances, or Dr. Bailly, Farnham's own sense of timing, intervened, the poison would act quite impersonally. One of the advantages and disadvantages of chemistry, it has no views on the ethics of collaboration." The Dean, who had been following this exchange with the expression of a man listening to his own obituary, cleared his throat.
"What of the college, Inspector? Of the Restoration Fund? Of these letters?" Brathwaite regarded him with professional gravity. "Mr.
Hartwell will face charges of embezzlement and fraud. The Victorian deception will require a statement to the benefactors. I should think the gargoyles may prove more troublesome in their afterlife than they ever were in stone." Whimsy smiled faintly. "On the contrary, Dean, you are about to enjoy a renaissance of academic interest. The great gargoyle fraud of Severin's will bring in more visiting scholars, antiquarians, journalists, and mildly depraved tourists than a dozen authentic medieval dripstones." The Dean shuddered. "Publicity of that sort is hardly desirable." "My dear sir," said Whimsy, reaching for his coffee with a grimace, "in an age that cheerfully questions everything from apostolic succession to the Oxford comma, you may be thankful if anyone still cares enough to be scandalized by architectural dishonesty." He rose, crossing to the window where the chapel roofline was visible against the receding fog. The scaffolding clung to the stone like an exoskeleton, while the grotesques leered down in their counterfeit antiquity. "Besides, you possess one priceless advantage over other institutions. You have a martyr." "Silas?" The Dean's voice softened. "Dr. Farnham," Whimsy said gently, "will be remembered not as a tedious pedant of Gnostic heresies, but as the courageous scholar who died rather than allow architectural truth to be buried beneath Victorian cement and modern bookkeeping. Miss Channing will see to that, you may depend upon it. If she is given paper, pen, and occasional reference access, she will produce a posthumous edition of his work that grants him both glory and guilt in exactly the proportions she deems appropriate." Brathwaite looked up sharply. "You think the Crown will—" "I think," Whimsy interrupted, "that a jury will find it remarkably difficult to treat her as a cold-blooded poisoner in the professional sense. She mixed intellectual outrage with emotional betrayal and produced that most unstable of compounds, the crime of passion conducted with the apparatus of reason. Your prosecutors will obtain their conviction. They will not obtain the gallows." There was a knock, and Bunting appeared, subdued and astonishingly neat, as though he had spent the dawn hours polishing his conscience along with the senior common room silver. "Begging your pardon, my lord, Inspector. Dean. Thought you might want to know Mr. Herrick left on the first train. Said he'd no intention of being mixed up further in parochial unpleasantness. Left this for you, Lord Peter." The envelope contained a brief, elegant note. Whimsy scanned it with raised eyebrow. "My professional thanks for preserving my name from the more lurid headlines. I shall, of course, withdraw any claim upon Dr. Farnham's research. One prefers one's manuscripts unassociated with cyanide." He folded the letter away. "And thus our London antiquarian sails gracefully out of the picture, leaving us with a dead scholar, a disgraced bursar, a ruined gargoyle industry, and a college poised uneasily between repentance and fundraising." The chapel bell began to toll the hour for what would have been Dr. Farnham's lecture. The sound rolled through the study with a peculiarly hollow resonance, as though it were being rung for a ghost. "Ah, well," said Whimsy, taking up his hat. "The Unwritten Lecture of Dr. Farnham will now be delivered in courts, newspapers, and footnotes for the next 50 years, which, for an Oxford man, is almost as good as immortality." It was not until several days later, in the civilized exile of Piccadilly, that the case of the Unwritten Lecture achieved its final, polished form in Lord Peter's mind. The fog of Oxford had been exchanged for London's more businesslike haze, and the Gothic shadows of Severin's for the tranquil, book-lined comfort of his own flat in Duke's Denver House. Bunter, moving with his usual sacerdotal precision, placed a tray upon the low table. Proper coffee this time, and a whisky of such parentage that no college cellar book would ever have dared record it honestly. The Dean of St. Severins has written, my lord, Bunter observed, laying a letter upon the arm of Whimsy's chair with the faintest hint of disapproval toward the institution that had so abused both architecture and justice. Whimsy broke the seal languidly. If he's inviting me to dedicate the new gargoyles, I refuse. I don't care to stand beneath a rain pipe with an expression of uplifted piety, however decorative. He skimmed the neat clerical hand. They have formally restored Miss Channing's name to the research on Dr. Aldridge's insistence. The paper will appear as Farnham and Channing. Hartwell has pleaded guilty to embezzlement, for the honour of the college, naturally. Herrick has generously donated certain Victorian correspondence to the Bodleian, no doubt to ensure posterity remembers him as a preserver of documents rather than an acquisitive
vulture. And Miss Channing, my lord? Bunter inquired, deftly adjusting the fire. Committed for trial, Whimsy replied, his tone quiet.
There will be medical evidence, of course. Exhaustion, strain, the slow corrosion of 20 years' intellectual effacement. The jury will call it temporary insanity. The dons will call it tragic. Both descriptions will be approximately accurate in their limited fashion. He folded the letter with unusual care. It is a comforting fiction, Bunter, that murder is committed only by coarse persons for coarse motives, money, jealousy, and so forth. It keeps the middle classes hopeful and the universities complacent. But ambition, when starved and politely ignored for long enough, will commit crimes as efficiently as poverty, only with better footnotes. Very true, my lord, said Bunter, who had photographed enough battlefields to recognize the logical extremes of human motive. Whimsy leaned back, staring past the bindings of Greek dramatists towards some inward reconstruction only he could see. Miss Channing did not kill for money, nor to silence the gargoyle fraud. If anything, she wished the fraud exposed. No, she killed because Farnham, built up over 2 decades of careful admiration and collaboration, chose to betray their intellectual marriage at the altar of academic prestige. Had he shared the credit generously, Hartwell might still be pilfering funds and the gargoyles grinning unmolested at future generations.
You are very hard upon the late doctor, my lord, Bunter ventured. Not hard, Whimsy answered, merely arithmetical.
He was an excellent scholar and a very careless human being. The dons will lament the former and ignore the latter, as is their custom. Yet in a curious fashion his last act had a kind of accidental nobility. By dying when he did, he forced the college to choose, publicly and irrevocably, between truth and convenience. One can hardly blame him for selecting such a dramatic exit. Medievalists are temperamentally inclined to martyrdom. Bunter poured the whisky with liturgical correctness.
And the gargoyles, my lord? Ah, yes, the stony chorus. Whimsy smiled faintly. They will remain, I think, at least for a time.
One can hardly remove the entire Victorian century without leaving drafts in the architecture. No, the college will label them delicately. 19th century restorations illustrative of contemporary attitudes toward the medieval. A phrase to warm the heart of any exam candidate. He rose, crossing to the window where London moved with unromantic efficiency beneath a thin winter sky. What remains, Bunter, is the usual dilemma. One solves these little puzzles, one puts the right people in the dock, and the newspapers proclaim that justice has been done. But the real culprits, vanity, neglect, institutional cowardice, remain cheerfully at large, dining in hall and endowing scholarships. Yes, my lord. Whimsy's smile sharpened with its familiar edge of irony. Still, we do what we can. We have restored, if not the gargoyles, at least the footnotes to their rightful owner. That is something. Fiat justitia, ruat caelum, though in this case it was only the ceiling bosses that threatened to fall. He turned back to the fire. Remind me, Bunter, to avoid Oxford for a term or two. It is an exhausting spectacle. watching men devote their lives to truth and then commit perjury over precedents in the bibliography. Very good, my lord, said Bunter. And now, Whimsy added, lifting his glass in a private toast to absent gargoyles and dead scholars, let us return to civilization. I believe there was a little matter of a stolen Rubens in Cork Street. Painters, on the whole, are less murderous than medievalists. They at least have the decency to sign their work. The fire sank, the whiskey glowed, and the case of Dr. Farnham's Unwritten Lecture closed itself with the quiet inevitability of a book returning to its proper place on a well-ordered shelf, its pages spotted, its margins annotated, its truth unpleasant but its logic impeccable.